It was just past 5 in the morning when he stepped onto the Charles Bridge. The fog curled low across the Vltava River, swallowing the lamps in a soft, amber glow. He wore a black overcoat, collar turned up, a wool scarf wrapped tight at the throat. No phone, no briefcase, just an aged leather satchel tucked under his left arm, creased at the edges, the clasp worn dull from years of use. Inside was a single envelope. No markings, no return address, only a seal, pressed wax, dark crimson, stamped with a small Hebrew letter most would never recognize. To the untrained eye, it looked like a courier on his morning walk. But to Mossad, this was the final leg of an operation that had been in motion for 13 years. The man's name, at least the one on record for this mission, was Ari Tal. His file was thin by design, no military rank, no official clearance level. He wasn't an agent in the traditional sense. He didn't carry a weapon. He had never killed a man. He was what Mossad called a dead-frame courier, a civilian trained for singular missions with one function: to deliver something too dangerous to transmit, too explosive to entrust to electronics, and too sensitive to risk falling into enemy hands. On this morning, that envelope might as well have been a detonator, because inside were 3 pages, handwritten, signed. The last words of a defecting Iranian nuclear scientist who had disappeared 6 weeks prior from a research facility outside Natanz. Pages that included one name, just one, that hadn't appeared in any intelligence report, satellite intercept, or embassy wire. That name changed everything. It pointed not just to a hidden facility, but to a second program, one buried beneath layers of misdirection and designed to continue even if the first was destroyed. Ari Tal didn't know any of this. He didn't need to. He'd been trained never to ask, never to break the seal, and never to look back, no matter who called his name, no matter what deal they offered, no matter how close the footsteps grew behind him, and they were growing closer. Across the bridge, just near the statue of St. John of Nepomuk, a man in a gray overcoat leaned on the stone railing, pretending to read a tourist map. But he wasn't a tourist. He wasn't even Czech. He was Syrian intelligence, posted in Vienna, pulled off assignment the night before. His team had tracked Ari through Munich, missed him in Dresden, and now waited here, betting he wouldn't see the man posted behind the bench 50 meters down the river path. But Ari did see them. He just didn't stop. His instructions were clear: get to the rendezvous, deliver the envelope, and disappear. But even Mossad hadn't anticipated how many governments would risk everything to stop that envelope from being opened. Because in just 48 hours, the paper inside would set fire to 1,000 diplomatic lies. And someone already knew. He ducked off the bridge and turned onto a narrow street just before the morning trams began to rattle. Old cobblestone alleys weaved through this part of Prague like veins, perfect for losing tails, terrible for staying dry. The rain had started without warning, sharp and cold. Ari didn't flinch. His pace remained steady, not rushed, not sluggish, just enough to look like a man with somewhere to be. He passed a bakery, a locksmith, and a shuttered record store before slipping into a cafe so nondescript it didn't even have a name on the door. Only a faded bell above the entrance announced his arrival. Inside, the lights were dim. One table occupied, a man reading a newspaper in Russian. The barista looked up, offered no smile, and returned to polishing a spoon behind the counter. This place didn't serve customers. It served purpose. Mossad had used it once before, nearly 2 decades earlier, when an operative needed to vanish after a botched tale in Sofia. The building above was vacant, the walls were double-lined, and the street cameras out front had technical issues twice a week, like clockwork. Ari took a seat by the back window facing the street. He placed the satchel on the floor, looped the strap around his ankle, and waited. 15 minutes. That was the window. He wasn't supposed to make contact. Just sit. Let the observers confirm he was alive, on schedule, and unharmed. If anything was off, If he looked panicked, bloodied, or missing the envelope, they would cancel the extraction. 5 minutes passed. The man with the Russian paper glanced over the edge once, a long, quiet look, then back to the print. 7 minutes. A couple walked by outside. Tourists, maybe. Or not. 9 minutes. A van rolled slowly past the cafe, its windows fogged from inside. It didn't stop. 11 minutes. The bell rang. Another man stepped in, tall, brown coat, clean-shaven, Czech, or trained to sound like it. He didn't look at Ari. He didn't need to. He dropped a folded receipt near the register, nodded at the barista, and left. Ari waited another full minute before standing, retrieving the receipt and sliding it into his coat pocket. He exited without looking back. It was a code, 3 digits. 741. It meant change routes, delay extraction, and one other thing. There was a tail. The moment he stepped back into the street, Ari's body adjusted instinctively, left hand in pocket, thumb resting on the edge of the small GPS scrambler hidden behind his belt, right hand brushing the zipper of the decoy satchel he'd been instructed to ditch. If cornered, he was alone again, but someone else was closing in. The cafe had confirmed one thing: he was still in the game. The question now was whether Mossad's game board had changed without telling the courier, because if Prague was compromised, the next rendezvous would become a gauntlet, and the envelope? Still untouched, still sealed, still pulsing with the kind of truth that could collapse alliances. The safehouse was supposed to be in Vinorati, tucked behind a florist shop that hadn't opened in 6 years. Mossad had used it for dead drops, courier transfers, and quiet overnight holds, never longer than 8 hours. It had 2 exits, 1 tunnel, and a fire escape disguised as an old drainage ladder. For years it had been silent and secure, but this time Echo didn't answer. Ari approached from the south, as trained. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. Wait. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. He stepped back from the gate, eyes scanning the nearby balconies. 1 curtain fluttered when it shouldn't have. 1 car had been parked too long. He didn't knock a 3rd time. Instead, he crossed the street, walked 3 blocks to a corner store, and ducked inside the public restroom. He peeled back the tile under the sink, just enough to reach the magnetic strip hidden beneath. The emergency code strip was still there, but the writing on the backside had changed. 1 word: abandoned. Echo was burned. Someone had flipped it. Whether it was Czech intelligence, Russian infiltration, or an internal leak didn't matter. Echo was compromised. There would be no shelter, no handoff, no exfil team waiting in the alley. Ari was on his own now, but that didn't mean he was lost. Every courier was given 2 final rules for operations like this. 1, if the system breaks, trust the envelope. 2, if the exit shuts, make one. The envelope contained more than just paper. Tucked beneath the wax seal was a second layer, an ultra-thin polymer tracing sheet encoded with heat-reactive ink, only visible under a very specific frequency of infrared. It wasn't for reading, it was for navigation. And Ari had the device embedded inside his belt buckle, a miniature IR reader, good for 1 scan, 1 time only. He found an underground passage near Namiesti Miru. It led to an old tunnel once used during World War II. No lights, no cameras, just dripping stone and the sound of his breath growing faster. There, in the dark, he broke the seal, not on the envelope, but on the reader, held it against the sheet. Coordinates appeared in a ghostly blue, a 6-digit grid pointing not to Prague, but to Brno, a city over 100 miles to the southeast. Brno hadn't been mentioned in the mission brief, but Ari didn't question it. If Echo was gone, the secondary drop was in play. That meant Mossad still believed in the courier, even if the path was now unlit. He wiped the sheet, pocketed the reader, and disappeared into the tunnel. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits stood outside the florist, pretending to smoke. One of them tapped an earpiece and muttered, "Echo's cold." The other checked his watch. Then the florist exploded. The signal was clear. Someone was willing to erase everything, even echo, to stop that envelope from reaching Brno. He boarded the train at Praha Hlavní nádraží just after 7, blending in with the early commuters. His coat was different now. Gray, longer, borrowed from a hostel room 2 blocks from the train station. The satchel, too, had changed. The original was gone, left near a construction site beneath a false grate. This one was older, scuffed, but inside it, the envelope remained, tucked behind a worn copy of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Mossad didn't believe in irony, but Ari did. The compartment was quiet. 4 seats, 1 window, 2 passengers, an old woman reading a Czech tabloid, and a man in a blue turtleneck sitting with his legs crossed, typing idly on a laptop. Ari sat across from him. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. He didn't have to, because the man across from him, who went by Ilan on agency logs, wasn't part of the original mission. He was a free agent. Technically not even Mossad. Former Shin Bet, burned after a border op in Haifa, but he owed a debt, and Tel Aviv had called it in. His wristwatch was cracked, deliberately so. That was the sign. Ari glanced at it once. No words passed between them. It was enough. The train began to move. And then something strange happened. Ilan closed his laptop, pulled a tiny device from his inner coat pocket, no larger than a matchbox, and placed it between them on the table. "No tracking for the next 2 stops," he said flatly, in Hebrew. Ari didn't respond. Ilan leaned closer. "Someone above me changed the rendezvous," he said. "Brno is no longer secure." Ari's heart sank, but his face didn't move. "Then why am I going there?" he asked. Ilan shook his head. "You're not." He slid a folded map across the table. "You're getting off in Jelava. There's a monastery, abandoned, 4 miles east. Look for a window with red thread in the sill." Ari stared at him. "I wasn't briefed on this." "No one was." "Then how do I know it's not a setup?" "You don't." The device between them beeped once. 30 seconds left before signal return. Ilan's face softened for a fraction of a second. "Listen, I don't know what's in the envelope. I don't want to know. But I do know this. 3 teams are already on your route. One of them is Russian, one of them is Iranian, and the third—" He paused. "The third might be ours." The silence hit harder than any gunshot could have. Ari nodded once, slid the map into his coat, and leaned back. The old woman coughed. The train passed a tunnel. When they emerged, Ilan was gone. Only the cracked watch remained on the seat. The second hand was frozen, as if warning Ari of what came next. Trust was no longer a strategy. It was a liability, and every minute moving toward Jelava was a minute closer to the truth, or to a kill box wrapped in lies. The monastery stood at the edge of a mist-covered forest, its stone walls cracked from centuries of rain and war. There were no signs, no priests, no tourists, only a broken archway overgrown with ivy and silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Ari reached it just before dusk, boots heavy with mud, lungs burning from the uphill trek through the woods. The envelope was still dry, still sealed, still pulsing like a second heartbeat against his chest. He scanned the windows. There, 4th frame from the left on the 2nd level, a sliver of red thread hung from the sill, barely visible in the dying light. It danced gently in the breeze, the kind of detail you'd miss if you weren't trained to see it. Ari approached slowly, mindful of the gravel beneath his feet. No birds, no animals, just the creaking wood of a forgotten house of God. He entered through a collapsed doorframe and moved quietly through the nave, past pews reduced to splinters and shattered stained glass. Every echo made the hairs on his arms stand upright. It didn't feel like a trap, but it didn't feel like safety either. Up a staircase worn smooth by centuries of sandals and boots, down a corridor lined with faded frescoes, and then light. A room with a candle burning in a glass cup placed on the floor in the exact center. Beside it, a woman, late 40s, dark hair tied back, no weapon visible. Her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She looked like someone who once knew war and had no patience for games. "You're early," she said, in unaccented English. "No," Ari replied. "You're late." She smirked. He set the satchel down gently. "You know what this is?" "I know what it could be," she said. "The question is, why deliver it now?" Ari didn't blink. "Because the war already started. The envelope just proves who planned it." She nodded, then knelt beside the candle and opened a small silver case. From it she withdrew a folded document. Not the envelope, her own. "This is from Langley," she said. "We've been tracking the same network. We had a defector, died in Istanbul 2 weeks ago, said the same thing yours did, but couldn't name the architect." Ari raised an eyebrow. "You think the envelope will?" "I think it might do worse." She didn't explain. Instead, she reached for it. He hesitated. She looked up. "You're not here to protect it anymore. You're here to witness what happens next." The wax seal cracked, the paper inside unfolded, and within seconds the woman's face changed. Not fear, not shock. Recognition. She looked at Ari. "You understand this implicates—" He cut her off. "I don't need to know." But he already did, because the name at the top wasn't foreign. It wasn't Arabic or Farsi or Russian. It was Hebrew, one of their own. The name written in looping black ink across the first page wasn't one Ari had expected to see outside of a Mossad briefing room, much less inside a hand-delivered death sentence. Zev Adler, a name that had once been spoken in whispers across Tel Aviv, reserved for backroom strategy meetings and deniable missions that didn't exist on paper. He had trained Ari once, not directly, but close enough. A legend. They used to call him until he vanished. Officially, Adler had retired 5 years earlier after a diplomatic dust-up in Morocco, but everyone knew the truth. He hadn't retired. He'd been repurposed, moved off the books, shifted into a shadow role so dark even his code name was scrubbed from the system. He became a ghost handler, a controller of assets so deep in hostile territory that even Mossad's top operatives weren't aware they were reporting to him. And now his name sat inked inside a defector's last confession, not as a mentor, not as an analyst, as the architect. Ari stepped back, hands shaking slightly. The woman watched him without speaking. She had already read the rest of the letter, every encrypted phrase, every confirmation of operations that were never meant to be linked together. Chemical shipments rerouted through fake charities, weapons caches stored inside refugee corridors, payments laundered through offshore Christian foundations to fund an extremist militia in a North African port city. And at the center of it all, Zev Adler. "He was never exiled," she said finally. "He built his own network, parallel to Mossad, using the same protocols, the same assets, but with different objectives." "What kind of objectives?" Ari asked, his voice hoarse. She folded the letter slowly. "Ones that don't serve any one country, just power." Ari tried to process it. The missions Adler had run, the lives shaped or shattered by his decisions. The war building in the background wasn't an accident. It wasn't geopolitical drift. It was orchestration. "How long have they known?" Ari asked. The woman hesitated, long enough to decide they didn't want to know anymore. That was the real betrayal. Not that Adler had gone rogue, but that some inside the system had made peace with it, because the results were useful, because he still delivered intelligence, because sometimes monsters serve a purpose. But now the envelope had surfaced, and with it, accountability. She reached into her jacket and produced a burner phone, dialed a number, waited, then spoke one sentence in Hebrew. "The courier has confirmed Adler." No emotion, no explanation. She ended the call. "That activates a protocol," she said. "Every safehouse he's used, every bank account, every contact, they'll be burned." "And Adler?" Ari asked. "He'll know before the hour is up. He'll run." Ari shook his head. No, he won't. She looked at him. Why not? Ari stared at the floor for a long moment, then said quietly, because he trained us to never run. They didn't try to triangulate him. Zev Adler had built the very software that could spoof signals across 3 continents. They didn't tail his known aliases either. His documents were always 2 years ahead of any system designed to detect forgeries. You didn't catch a man like Adler by chasing him. You lured him, slowly, carefully, with the one thing he'd trained himself to believe no longer existed: emotional vulnerability. Ari sat in the candlelit room of the monastery, watching the woman type into an unregistered laptop hooked to a signal-masking satellite relay. The connection wasn't just secure, it was deliberately broken in places, patterned to mimic the digital handshake of a handler Adler had once trusted in Kazakhstan. A ghost signal, a voice print, a signature Adler had buried under 6 levels of dead code. Then the final piece, the recording. Ari had made it 5 years earlier, during an advanced debriefing session in Tel Aviv, one Adler himself had led. Back then, it had seemed like routine analysis, deconstructing failed courier routes, drilling psychological pressure responses, fine-tuning instinct over protocol. But the recorder Mossad had planted in the chair wasn't for archival, it was for leverage. Now it played back a single phrase in Ari's voice, something Adler had once drilled into him during live fire exercises in the Negev. Even a ghost leaves a footprint in fresh snow. It was a code Adler had used once. It meant, meet me in person. Nothing digital, no observers, one chance. The message was embedded in a scrambled burst to a private relay channel Adler used when staging disappearances. The woman hit send. Then they waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then a single ping. One word. Where? It worked. The woman typed, the place you buried the Turkish passport. No further reply came, but she didn't need one. That means he's already in country, she said, exhaling for the first time in hours. Where's the place? Ari asked. She looked up. Istanbul, Çukurcuma. Of course it was, the neighborhood where Adler had once faked his own death by car bomb, where Mossad had lost 2 agents trying to confirm the body, where, beneath the ruined antique bookstore, Adler had hidden an emergency passport in the name of Emre Tuncel, a Turkish academic who hadn't existed since 1983. That's where he would go. Not because he needed the passport, but because he wanted to know who remembered. Ari stood. He didn't need permission. He was no longer a courier. He was bait. The woman handed him a burner phone, a set of Istanbul metro tokens, and a slim vial of microfilm. What's this? He asked. She hesitated. Proof. Of what? She looked him in the eyes. That Adler's network didn't just sell weapons. Pause. They sold wars. Ari pocketed the vial. He was no longer delivering information. He was walking into the lion's den with nothing but memory, loyalty, and a single sentence Adler had taught him to believe. Even a ghost leaves a footprint. Istanbul doesn't forget. That's what Adler used to say. Cities like London may erase themselves and rebuild. New York buries the past beneath ambition. But Istanbul, she remembers. Every cobblestone in Çukurcuma had seen revolutions, betrayals, disappearances. The buildings leaned inward, whispering history through their cracked plaster and soot-stained eaves. Ari moved through it like a ghost, retracing another ghost's steps. He didn't carry the envelope anymore. That part of the mission was over. Now he carried something worse, the knowledge that Adler had orchestrated arms deals designed not to shift the balance of power, but to keep it perpetually tipping. Proxy conflicts were not accidents. They were engineered, sparked and fed by data Adler leaked, money he redirected, alliances he quietly poisoned. Ari couldn't stop wondering how many agents had died believing they were saving the world, when they were just chess pieces on Adler's personal board. The bookstore was still there, just like the woman said. Shuttered, forgotten, a metal gate rusted half shut. Above it, the faded outline of hand-painted lettering, Cartographia, maps. That was the irony. It had never sold books, only old charts and topographical scrolls from crumbling empires. Ari stepped under the gate, ducked through a side alley, and found the door hidden beneath a collapsible awning. It was unlocked. He didn't hesitate. Inside, dust hung like fog, shelves bent under the weight of decaying paper. The scent of mold and ink filled his lungs. In the back, a staircase curved downward into a forgotten cellar. He followed it. One flickering bulb illuminated the room. A desk, a chair, a single map of the Golan Heights pinned to the wall with a red string running from Quneitra to the Israeli border. And a man. Zev Adler, older, thinner, wearing a black sweater and the same blank expression Ari remembered from training. His eyes were the only part of him that looked alive, sharp, assessing, dangerous. Ari said nothing. Adler didn't move. After a moment, he nodded toward the desk. "You brought it?" "No," Ari replied. Adler raised an eyebrow. "I didn't come to deliver," Ari said. "I came to ask why." Adler chuckled softly. "Why? You know better than that. There is no why. There's only what works. You trained us to protect the state. I trained you to win." Ari stepped closer. "At what cost?" Adler's smile vanished. "You think wars end when you kill a man, when you sign a treaty? No, wars end when no one profits from them anymore. Until then, someone like me always exists." Ari reached into his coat. Adler tensed, but instead of a gun, Ari pulled out the microfilm vial. He placed it on the desk. "This proves everything," he said. Adler stared at it. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "And yet, here you are, giving me the chance to disappear again." Ari didn't blink. "That's not why I'm here." Adler's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you here?" Ari answered quietly, "To make sure this is your last map." The next morning, a train departed from Istanbul's Sirkeci station, heading northwest across the Thracian plains. It carried 27 passengers, 5 crates of industrial sensors, a diplomatic pouch from the Israeli consulate, and 0 trace of Zev Adler. The station log showed a man matching his description boarding platform 2, purchasing a ticket to Plovdiv, Bulgaria. Cameras confirmed his movement to the edge of the train, and then nothing. He never boarded. The man who had manipulated 3 wars, financed 4, and sold information to 6 countries simply vanished. Again. But this time, Mossad didn't chase, because this time they had something Adler didn't. They had the story. Ari sat in a safe flat in Vienna, staring at the still-sealed microfilm vial. He hadn't handed it over. Not to Adler. Not to the Americans. Not even to Mossad. The woman from the monastery had gone silent, her burner number cold, her last safe house raided. Someone had decided that silence was the only path forward, that exposing Adler would ignite too many fires, embarrass too many governments, unravel too many alliances, and yet the envelope had done its job. The courier had delivered the truth. Now the truth sat in his pocket like a loaded gun. He had options. Leak it to a journalist in Paris, drop it into a dead letterbox in Berlin, upload it to an anonymous server routed through Belarus. Each move carried a consequence. Each path ended in someone's execution, political, literal, or both. But that wasn't what haunted him. What haunted him was the train, because he had been there. Ari had followed Adler to the platform. He had watched him step toward the car. He had seen him hesitate, and he had watched him turn around. No panic, no rush, just acceptance. They locked eyes for half a second, and in that half second, Adler had looked tired, not cornered, not defeated, just finished. He had built an empire out of shadows, and now he was ready to disappear into them, but not before passing a final message. It came in the form of a small folded note left inside Ari's coat pocket, tucked there without him noticing. One sentence: "Tell them it wasn't about money." Ari didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. Because he knew it was true. Adler had never chased wealth. He had chased control, stability through disruption, peace through fear. He had believed, in some twisted way, that the chaos he orchestrated prevented worse chaos from forming. That was the terrifying part. He believed he was the solution, not the threat. Now the man was gone, maybe dead, maybe not, but the courier remained, with an envelope that had changed a war and a story that no one wanted told. So he sat in Vienna, watching trains arrive and depart, waiting for the right moment, for the right leak, for the next courier who would take the burden from his hands and finish what began on a fog-covered bridge in Prague. 3 weeks later, a sealed diplomatic envelope was logged into the Israeli embassy's diplomatic pouch system in Vienna. Hand-delivered. No return name, no cover letter. Just a wax seal cracked slightly at the edges and the smell of old paper and damp wool. It was addressed to a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Director Yitzhak Ben-Hanan, retired, last known to live in Haifa. The clerk marked it for internal routing, but the courier assigned to the task, 26, fresh from desk rotation in Herzliya, paused. There was something strange about the weight of the paper, too heavy for a memo, too delicate for standard files. He brought it to his supervisor, who glanced at the seal, frowned, and placed it in a secure drawer. "It'll be processed," the supervisor said. It never was. 2 days later, the envelope disappeared from the drawer. No one signed it out. No one asked. Because some letters are never meant to arrive. Some truths are too costly. Ari knew this would happen. That's why he didn't send the original. What Tel Aviv never received was the microfilm, the real file, the one that proved the arms deals Adler had brokered weren't rogue but sanctioned. Not just by him, but by factions inside the system who viewed him as a useful virus, a firewall against chaos, a necessary evil. The letter had contained a summary, enough to rattle, not enough to convict. That was the gamble. Ari didn't watch for fallout. He didn't wait for confirmation. He left Vienna 3 hours after mailing it, disappeared from agency eyes. Some say he moved to Argentina. Others claim he became a ghost handler himself, one of those rare few who still believe in something greater than control. But what everyone agrees on is this: the envelope worked. Within months, 2 weapons shipments were quietly recalled. A proposed intelligence sharing pact between 3 nations stalled without explanation, and one particular Mossad division, codename Olive Root, was quietly dismantled and scrubbed from internal directories. No headlines, no arrests, just silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes inside the walls of power. Back in Istanbul, the bookstore burned down in a mysterious fire that no one investigated. Chukurkuma moved on. New maps were painted, new wars whispered. But one day, inside a small cafe, 2 blocks from where the bookstore once stood, a waitress noticed something odd. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath her tip tray. No signature, just one sentence, handwritten in black ink. Even a ghost leaves a footprint in fresh snow. She didn't understand it. She threw it away. But somewhere, the man who wrote it was still walking, still watching, still remembering, because the job of a courier never really ends. Not when you've carried something that changed a war. Not when the real delivery is the memory itself.